Salvis Search for the Universe. Chapter 14. Peter ran hard, arms filled with as many papers as he could carry. Jars of ink hung on strings over his elbows. His back was burdened by several gifts representing varying degrees of bribery, from insultingly obvious to coyly covert. His legs wobbled. His arms felt heavy. He had no choice but to take them all at once. Why had he no choice? It was simply because he had no time. The courier hall was just too far. He wished he could ask another servant, but if he tried, he would have been immediately rebuffed with questions of why he needed someone else to do his job. And it wasn't as if he could up and tell them how much he would love to do it himself, except he was a little occupied with handling the laws of the entire kingdom of Turnham, as if he were the king himself. No, he couldn't do that. He would be executed on the spot. He didn't know what Manacle was thinking. He was his apprentice for God's sake. The near decade studying under him was the only thing that gave him enough confidence in the man to trust that he hadn't gone as mad as King Tynedale himself. Manacle was smart. He must have a good reason. That was all he could tell himself. The stress was too much. Someone like him, passing judgment in the king's name? The guilt alone threatened to crush him. His heart felt ready to burst. It had been days since he last slept, and his appetite had completely vanished. But he still felt like vomiting, despite the pit in his gut. He ran, feet echoing across smooth marble floors, his face buried in the mountain of papers, obscuring the wry glances cast his way. He turned a corner, impacted, and flew backwards, shouting in shock as he fell. Papers spewed like slag spewed from a volcano. He bruised his tailbone on the stone. "Watch where you're going, boy!" A knife-edged voice growled. Peter looked up in shock and leapt to prostrate himself, his forehead pressed upon the cold, cold marble. "Please forgive me, Duke Rondo. I could not see where I was going." Rondo adjusted his robe, standing inflexibly, as if he'd done nothing more than swat away a fly. And, as Peter recalled, it hadn't felt like he had collided with the man, more like he had been pushed down. "Couldn't see where you were going, and your first instinct was to barrel down halls like a runaway carriage, huh?" "I'm sorry. I was in a hurry. It won't happen again." "You were in a hurry," Rondo repeated, almost amused. Peter silently cursed himself for saying something so stupid. Manacle wouldn't have made that mistake. "You really should be punished for this." Peter's breath caught. "I'm sorry," he said again, voice drenched with real desperation. "I simply cannot accept punishment right now. Manakel and I are very busy. If he lost his servant even for a day, it could damage the kingdom." Rondo looked down his nose, seeming to consider the statement. Then he sneered. "I see he's taught his dog how to beg." Had it not been for his position, he would have spat. "No, he will not suffer punishment, but you will pass this on to the old bastard. His discretion lately has been decidedly impertinent. It would behoove him to avoid dragging my dear kingdom into the dirt before we have time to put another upon the throne." Peter swallowed hard. He knew it. He knew he had been making an utter mess of things. His vision narrowed as his eyes widened. His throat felt knotted and dry. He forced it down, but too late. Rondo saw his reaction and pounced, grabbing his arm and dragging him to his feet, pulling Peter's arm into his body, pinioning it under his armpit. Rondo pressed his thumb into Peter's palm. "Your hands are curiously calloused and bruised from a mere servant. And you smell terribly of ink. Tell me, for what purpose is Manakel's servant writing so diligently? Peter tried to break free, but the aged man was deathly strong. His strength, built campaigning with the king, was clearly staunch as ever. He's been so busy, he's had me copying down notes for him." "Notes? Manakel?" Rondo couldn't decide whether to be amused or offended. "The only notes that man keeps are in his head, boy." Again, he silently cursed himself. He'd known Manakel for over a decade. He knew that. Why had he said notes? It's true. I thought it was weird at first as well, but he's been so busy lately. He must have had no choice. Rondo eyed him warily, but decided to let him go. Peter stumbled upright, rubbing his wrist. He knelt down and began the laborious process of gathering everything he had dropped. An entourage of soldiers appeared down the hall, clad in shining armor, befitting a duke's escort. Rondo strode to them, as if expecting them. "Be sure to pass on my message," he called back to him, and was gone. Peter gathered up the rest of the scattered paper. He was so relieved it was over. He had completely forgotten how little time he had. It wasn't 2 steps before he was already running again, dashing for Manakel's office, navigating the halls not by sight, but by memory. He made it, panted, and kicked the door twice with his foot. He thanked the heavens that Manakel came to open it, before he staggered inside and dumped the lot onto the center of the floor. By the time he looked, Manakel was already hunched over his desk, poring over family trees, treaties, and various other documents. Manakel had never told him what he was researching, but he had determined it must be something for the succession, though he knew not how.
"What are you standing there for?"
Manakel asked, without taking his eyes off his desk.
"You have work to do."
Peter did not stir. He laced his fingers.
"Master, I can't take this anymore. People can tell it's someone else. They can tell. I can't take it. I'm just not fit for this. You're really wrong, but choosing me was a mistake. It's not a matter of whether you're fit, but you must do it. You understand? You must do it. There is no choice." "But why? What is in that dusty old book that is so important you would turn over control of the kingdom to your servant? Please, Manakel, I can't understand what you're thinking."
Manakel was silent. His back heaved a regretful sigh.
"That is not for you to know right now, but I pray I may one day be able to tell you. Someday soon. I hope." "But—"
Peter was cut off as Manakel turned to face him, eyes ablaze. He stood, tearing off his spectacles from his face, slicing his hand through the air as he shouted,
"You know nothing. You are my servant. You have no cause to question me."
Peter stared in a dumb stupor, eyes wide. Not once had Manakel raised his voice against him, and not once had he ever demanded something from him as a servant. He had always called him assistant, never once invoking his right. It cut Peter to the core. The shame, the shock. Peter stumbled back, and Manakel saw he had hurt him. His eyes softened.
"I'm sorry."
He shook his head.
"I'm afraid I have coddled you too much. Having none myself, I must admit that I have come to think of you as something like a son, but you cannot rely on me in your entire life."
He clapped Peter on the shoulder.
"I'm sure it is obvious, but I will not be around forever. You are still young and well, I am old."
He looked deep into Peter's eyes.
"You may not believe in yourself, but if you can trust your mentor, then can you not trust in the one he raised as his successor?"
There was a flash of something behind Peter's eyes, something like understanding. He nodded and smiled wearily.
"Now,"
Manakel started wryly,
"I hate to do this as soon as you've returned, but I'm going to need you to fetch another batch from the Royal Registry."
He held out a slip of paper. Peter gawked at it and seemed to fight some internal struggle before shaking his head and settling on a bitterly amused grin. before snatching it from Manacle's old, cracked hands and leaving. Manacle stood alone in the room. He raked his hand through what remained of his hair and rubbed his face. He glanced at the heap of paper upon his desk. 2 weeks, and nothing to show for it. He had pored over countless family trees, laws, and letters. All he had discovered were cloak and dagger political alliances and petty offences that eventually needed to be dealt with in their own time, but only served to annoy him at present. His foe had to be from the inside. It was the only possibility that made sense. Yet he could find no trace of this person. Even his network of spies had turned up completely empty. It made him dreadfully aware that he was past his prime. His bones ached, and a headache had been gnawing at his brainstem for the better part of the day. But he would persevere. He had to. He returned to his chair, leaned back, and stared at the rafters for a time. No, that wasn't good. He had work to do. He forced himself to attention, but he decided it wouldn't hurt to check on the pendant, even though he hadn't left the room since he last checked. He stepped through the process of unlocking the compartment and almost tore the drawer out in shock. The pendant was glowing. So faint. He wouldn't have noticed it if not for the shadows within. Its twin was getting closer. He didn't know if he should be delighted or terrified. But it meant at least one thing. The pendant was still intact. The pendant was still intact. Salvis swung her arms as she walked, and would have been whistling had her anatomy allowed it. Travelling was so simple when you were following the road. After being with Branwellcoff for so long, travelling alone felt a little lonesome. He had elected to stay behind after the villagers had begged him to no end to keep playing his music. He wasn't about to pass up the only people to enjoy his music, and he had moved in with Raymond, who had given his house to Salvi as promised. But she had no use for a house and passed it to Branwellcoff, who in turn passed it back to Raymond, in turn for letting him board there. Though she did end up taking a small silver ring, which was about the only thing Raymond begged her not to take. But it was so shiny she really couldn't resist herself. Branwellcoff had promised to catch up eventually, whispering something about how it was too rural for his liking, even if they did enjoy his music. So here she was, walking on her own. It had been about a week since then. She had entered Ithrantlium, which was apparently the name of the city where they had wound up after stumbling through the wilderness, and was on her way to Grubach, having bypassed Clusterfolk entirely thanks to their little detour. It was the last stop on her journey to Panes. Excitement prickled up and down her spine, but there was another inexplicable sensation burning at her back. It was the feeling of being watched. She couldn't explain it, but for some time now she felt like someone was following her. At first she had thought it was just some humans behind her, but when some eventually did pass, it hadn't done anything to assuage the feeling. It was probably just the fungus she ate, she decided. She tried not to think about it too hard. Some humans were approaching. She ducked off to the side and kept walking through the forest until they passed. She had learned her lesson the first times she met some passing humans. For some reason, they always assumed she was going to attack them, and decided to preempt her attack by striking first. She stepped back onto the road. It was really convenient how humans just built these things everywhere. The thought conjured up images of Itty, and her stupid, drooling grin returned. She rarely paid attention to the weather, because as long as it did not slow her down, it was all the same. But for what it was worth, it was muggy, and altogether uncomfortable weather to travel in for warm bloods. The sun drifted towards the horizon, as the trees' shadows stretched like long, dark fingers. She decided it was time to find a place to get some sleep. Not because it was night, for she was not one to be found beholden to such routines, and instead preferred to sleep whenever she felt tired, but by mere coincidence. She searched for a suitable place amongst the trees, and settled upon a dense thicket, largely hollow on the inside, but shelter from the sun and inconspicuous from the outside. She was in the middle of piling up a mound of dirt and foliage to rest her head upon, when she heard screams and shouting coming from the outside. She stuck her head into the bush and peered through the lattice of twigs. She heard the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the shouts of men in the distance, but getting closer all the time. And then she saw them. 2 men dashed through the trees. Salvi blinked, then rubbed her eyes. It almost looked like their clothes were shifting in colors. They seemed to match their surroundings wherever they were. The 2 men ran at alarming speed as they tried to outrun the thunder of hooves. But as fast as they were, they could not escape. The horses came into view, men shouting, weapons ready. Some hurled projectiles at the fleeing pair. They dodged them easily. The horsemen's uniforms looked familiar. Salvi crossed her arms, tail swinging as she thought. That's right. They look like Braum. He was always wearing those kinds of things. She figured they must be his friends or whatever. 2 of his friends had been nice. But she couldn't say the same about all the others she had met, and elected to stay out of sight. Whatever it was had nothing to do with her, and she wanted it to stay that way. The riders shouted to seize the two men, but they were slippery. The riders closed the distance, and the two were forced to sidestep the spears and dive away before being trampled. It was chaos. She found herself rooting for the two men on foot, as they desperately maneuvered to avoid being flanked. It was one blur, then another passed, followed by a rush of horses. Branches shook, leaves fell. The ground quaked, and then they were past. She poked her head out further to get a better look. After some deliberation, she decided to root for the horsemen instead, since the two reminded her of that scary human from the castle. She strained her eyes further and further, and huffed when they disappeared before she got to see the conclusion of the skirmish. She sat down and laid her head on the makeshift pillow. She tossed, then turned. It wasn't working. She shot up, arms thrust to the sky. She couldn't sleep without knowing what happened next. She poked her head back through the bush, but they were long gone. There was no trace of sound, and even the lingering dust had settled. She didn't even know which direction they had gone. It was obvious, even to her, that she would never get to know. She slumped back into her bed, staring at the ceiling of leaves and twigs, troubled. It would take her forever to fall asleep. It took her at least 5 minutes to forget the whole thing, then fell asleep instantly, dreaming of Itty, hoisting it high, only for it to turn into a nightmare as Branelkoff appeared to play her a tune to celebrate. She woke up, feeling less rested than she should have. She stretched her arms over her head and yawned. She brushed the roof of her den, and dew rained down. The air was heavy, as the sun had yet to rise. Salvi looked over in the middle of her stretch. There was a fox looking at her. Salvi blinked. Its hackle spiked and lunged at her, teeth bad. She caught it, tumbled backwards, and tussled with it, tooth and nail. The hissing, yipping, and tussle went on until Salvi landed a champion's uppercut to the critter's jaw and sent it flying. It scrambled to its feet and fled with its tail between its legs, making a stupid noise as it went. Salvi harumphed in its direction as she dusted herself off. It wasn't the best start to her day, but she didn't let it keep her down. Within minutes she was back on the road, marching towards her destiny with a smile on her face. She didn't encounter many humans this time, but for some reason that feeling of being watched had disappeared. It had definitely been that weird fungus she had eaten. The day was uneventful, and it stretched on into an uneventful night, then an uneventful week. She ate when she was hungry, slept when she was sleepy. It was simply existence. Once she had run out of water and struggled to find a watering hole, but clearly the gods favored her campaign, because then it began to rain so heavily. All she had to do was hinge open her jaw and stare at the sky as she walked, to have her fill. The road abruptly changed to pavement as the forest gave way to farms. The road had done this near Luhorn too. She was getting close. The excitement prickled down her spine, all the way to the tip of her tail. She ran with such anticipation, it was hardly dusk by the time she made it to the city. She stared at it, standing proud in the distance. It didn't look as impressive as Luhorn, but she ranked it far above Etra Tiddlidum, or whatever it was called. The walls weren't made of wood, for one thing. She ran to the gates. Guards came into view, and she was running towards them as they pointed at her, and the sound of a horn suddenly split the air. She was still running towards them until an entire horde of guards spilled from the gates, charging her like the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. She skidded to a halt, turned the other way, and made it 2 steps before something struck her in the back, blasting the air from her lungs and throwing her to the ground. She landed hard, sucking air, just for it to be forced out again as an armored boot stomped her spine. There wasn't even enough left for her to scream. Everything felt so dull and foreign from the end of a light-shafted tunnel. The men were all shouting, muffled in her ringing ears as they seized her arms, limp as whittled greens, and marched her into the city.
You've captured one!
Tybalt's disbelieving shout was loud enough to wake up the entire camp. He stood in his tent, barely dressed beyond his small clothes. 3 scouts stood, faces flicking through casts of orange in the lamplight. "Yes, sir," said the head scout. He was cordial, disciplined, respectful, but inside he was happy as a butcher's dog. It was in the middle of the night when Tybalt's servants had dragged him out of his bed, saying that the scouts were outside requesting a meeting. He yawned and dressed himself to the bare minimum of decency, eyes half-lidded as he fell into his seat and struggled to keep from falling asleep before the servants could call in the scouts. But he was wide awake now.
That's fantastic!
He was so excited he had completely forgotten his feigned personality.
Excellent! Yes! Well done! Yes! Ha-ha! Well done!
All that was left was to torture the rest of the information out of their prisoner. And soon they could head back home. He was happy. The two in the back shared a glance. It was odd to see him that genuine, but they took it as nothing more than a sign of how truly happy he really was. "Thank you, sir." All three bowed, but their good cheer was tainted somewhat. "We located two during our search of the forest south of Gribak, but unfortunately the other one was able to escape by running down a steep hill where our horses could not chase."
No matter. As long as we have one, it's plenty worth celebrating.
He stood up and hurriedly dressed himself the rest of the way.
Come on, bring me to our little prisoner. I want to see him.
The scouts bowed and led him outside the tent. It was dark as night, but half the camp was abuzz. News had travelled fast. Soldiers talked excitedly amongst the field of 30-some-odd tents, cheering as the scouts had come through without a care for the other half who had elected to remain in bed. Tybalt slipped into the tent, still smiling, and stopped. The guards inside were silent. One sat slump, his face in his hands. Face a pale mask of defeat. They saw him enter, and his smile withered. He followed the eyes to the floor and saw the lifeless corpse sitting in the middle of the tent. The body had been stripped naked, revealing the caramel cast of its skin and the willowy condition of its muscles. Tybalt fled.
Who did this?
His baneful gaze swept the room, a hand itching to draw his sword.
Who killed him?
It wasn't us who killed him, sir. One of the guards spoke up, his voice sour from the lingering disappointment. Tybalt recognized him from the odd, bow-legged way he walked, though he could not recall his name. There isn't a single wound anywhere on his body. The only bruises he's got are from his restraints. Tybalt clenched his fists.
Damn! Damn! Damn!
He searched for something to smack and found only his thigh.
How did this happen?
The scouts dropped him off, and when we went to drive in the spikes to restrain him, he suddenly started convulsing and died in seconds. Poison, I guess. He shrugged. Must have had it in his mouth.
We,
the leader of the scouts, added. We stripped him naked, fearing he would try to take his own life. But we did not think to search his mouth after seizing him, even in the days it took to transport him back here. We are to blame for this. No. Tybalt waved his hands. His rage had cooled. If you'd tried to search his mouth, he would have swallowed it on the spot. He found a place to sit, laced his fingers, and stared at the floor. Damn it. The mood was dismal. Did we learn anything? Who these men are? Who they're working for? What their goals are? Anything? The lead scout drew his lips into a line, and tried as he might, he could not think of anything, to put it lightly. No, not yet. It was as optimistic as he could put it. Here's the equipment we took off him when he was captured. What is this? It's some kind of color-shifting cloak. It's much duller now, but when he was wearing it, it was able to blend in with his surroundings. Well, we already knew they were no ordinary thieves, but... He forced himself to smile, weak as it was. Perhaps we should be celebrating we managed to kill even one. The guards and scouts seemed to tactically agree. Anything else? The head scout laid out everything they had taken on top of his cloak, items ranging from the obvious to the obscure and downright enigmatic. One that seemed to stand out the most was the strange piece of glass that was so plain and lacking in any aesthetics that the only possible explanation for it was some kind of memento. The assortment looked like the wares displayed outside some kind of shady shop. Tybalt stared at the items, but his understanding stopped at anything lacking a sharpened edge, and from the looks of it, his soldiers couldn't make head nor tails of it either. Pack it up, he commanded. If anyone can make sense of this mess, it's Abram. Send it to Lou Horn immediately. Yes, sir. The scouts crouched and began readying it for transport. Tybalt stole another glance at the corpse. He should be happy. He should be happy, he told himself. It was better than nothing, but he couldn't help but feel disappointed after all his excitement had come crashing down. He yawned, and just like that, all his fatigue came back. Get that corpse out of here. Bury it, burn it, throw it in a ditch. I don't care. The guards bowed, and Tybalt made his way to the exit and stopped. There was a terrible clamour outside, voices shouting indistinctly. He strained his ears and caught it as it came closer. Where is Tybalt? Someone asked over and over, the other voices giving directions. Tybalt stepped outside just in time to come face to face with an unknown rider. The horse stamped relentlessly, flares of fog shooting from its nostrils. It had been riding hard. The soldier's colors were unlike any other soldier in the camp. Tybalt strained to remember the uniform. Gribbuck?
Are you Sir Tybalt?
The rider asked. Yes, I am Sir Tybalt. For what purpose does one of the Gribbuck guard come riding into my camp?
I bring news that may be of some interest to you. Lord Pharos sent us a letter. Is it true you are in pursuit of a man and a kobold thief?
It seems like it's more than one man now, he admitted wryly. But yes, your information is correct.
We believe we have the kobold thief you are looking for in custody. We captured them outside the city gates not soon before dusk.
You captured them?
Yes, sir.
Are you certain it's the same kobold we are after?
The letter mentioned they might be in possession of some kind of pendant, one that looks like it's been broken in half. We found something like it on their person, but if it...
You have the pendant?
Tybalt shouted, and caught himself too late. The rider stared at him suspiciously, but let it pass. He had clearly realized there was something there, but it was not his place to pry into noble affairs. Yes. Tybalt turned.
You!
He shot his finger at a guard whose name he could not recall, who looked deadly pale for some reason.
Spread the order! We are packing up immediately and heading for Gribbuck. The scouts will lead you.
He turned back to the rider.
And you will lead me.
As long as you let me swap horses, I have no objections, the rider said calmly. To address him so casually, Tybalt decided that the man's rank was much higher than it had first appeared. The camp flew into motion, and within moments Tybalt was on the back of his pure white stallion, riding harsh into the blackest night. Excitement crept in his belly. He let it in cautiously. Perhaps he would find nothing but a kobold's corpse upon his arrival. But it wouldn't matter in the slightest, so long as he held the pendant.